For centuries, these were just stories. A city that angered the gods and sank beneath the waves. Warrior women, the Greeks swore they fought. A lost trading hub swallowed by the desert. Historians rolled their eyes. Textbooks called them legends. And then archaeologists started digging. Because every so often, a myth steps out of the storybooks and into the ground beneath our feet. At Fiction Foundry, we usually take myths apart. Where did they start? Who spread them? And how much truth survives under all the exaggeration? But today, I want to flip that script. We're looking at 7 myths and legends that mainstream scholars once brushed off as fiction, propaganda, or pious storytelling, until archaeology, satellite imagery, and some very patient fieldwork forced them to admit, okay, we were wrong. There is something here. We're not talking about perfect one-to-one matches. The real past is always messier than the stories. But in each case, the physical evidence lines up just enough to change the conversation from, that never happened, to, alright, what actually happened? Let's start with a war poem that refuses to stay imaginary. For a long time, Troy lived where most epics live, on the fiction shelf. The Iliad describes a decade-long siege, god-infested battlefields, and heroes with suspiciously good plot armour. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, many scholars treated Troy the way we treat Westeros. A brilliant, detailed world, but not a GPS location. Then a wealthy, extremely obsessed German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann decided, no, really, this has to be a real place. In the 1870s, he started digging at a hill in modern-day Turkey called Hisarlik. What he found was not a city of Troy, but layers of cities built on top of one another, stretching back millennia. Among those layers, thick fortification walls, burn layers showing massive destruction, weapons and rubble that suggested serious violence. Suddenly, the idea that Troy was purely fictional became hard to defend. Today, most historians think the Trojan War story is a mythologized memory of real late Bronze Age conflicts around that region. The gods, the glowing armour, the perfectly scripted duels. Storytellers' embellishments. But a powerful trading city on the Anatolian coast, besieged and destroyed in the right time window, that part looks a lot less like fantasy. Sometimes you don't find the exact city from the poem. You find enough of it that the poem stops being just a poem. Next up, North America. For centuries, Icelandic sagas told stories about a mysterious western land, Vinland. According to the texts, Norse sailors found a place with wild grapes, timber, and depending on the translation, either friendly neighbours or very angry ones. Most European historians shrug, nice story, maybe a bit of wishful thinking. No way the Vikings reached North America centuries before Columbus, right? Then, in the 1960s, archaeologists Helga and Anne Stein Ingstad went poking around the tip of Newfoundland in Canada, at a place called L'Anse aux Meadows. They found the remains of tough houses built in distinctly Norse styles, iron nails and rivets from ship repairs, a bronze pin used to fasten Viking cloaks, radiocarbon dates around the year 1000, exactly when the sagas claimed those voyages took place. Suddenly, Vinland wasn't just a saga location. It had post holes, hearths, and a visitor's centre. Do we know if the exact site matches each scene in the sagas? No. Do we know whether the grapes in the story were literally or just good resources? Still debated. But the bigger question, did Vikings really cross the Atlantic and build a settlement in North America? That went from fringe theory to accepted history. One excavation and a national myth about discovering the New World quietly lost its monopoly. In Greek myth, the Amazons were fearsome warrior women from somewhere on the fringes of the known world. They write into epic poems, fight heroes like Heracles and Achilles, and defy every norm of Greek womanhood. For a long time, historians treated them as exactly that, a thought experiment. What if women acted like the men we write about in war stories? Then archaeologists started opening burial mounds, kurgans across the Eurasian steppe, home to nomadic groups like the Scythians and Sarmatians. Inside they found women buried with weapons, bows, arrows, spears. Skeletal evidence of riding, femurs and hips shaped by life on horseback. Battle injuries that had healed, meaning these women survived long enough to keep fighting. In some regions, roughly a third of the warrior burials were biologically female. Now mix that with Greek traders and soldiers encountering these horse archer societies on the Black Sea frontier. You don't need a wild imagination to go from some of their women fight just like their men to they have entire tribes of warrior women. The archaeological record doesn't give us a matriarchal Amazon empire, but it does give us something the Greeks insisted existed and many moderns dismissed. Real women in real warrior roles whose lives looked a lot like the legends. For a while, the Hittites were in an awkward place. They appear in the Hebrew Bible as a recognisable group. They show up in Egyptian records as serious military rivals. But in the 19th century Europe, outside of those texts, there was nothing. No ruins you could confidently point to say, here they were. No inscriptions that screamed, welcome to Hittite territory. So some scholars quietly started treating them as a semi-legendary or at least greatly exaggerated. Then, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, excavations in central Turkey started turning up something different. Massive city ruins at a place now called Hattusa, fortification walls, temples, gates carved with lions, and most importantly, archives of clay tablet in a previously unknown Indo-European language. It took decades to crack that script, but when linguists finally read it, realised they were looking at the royal records of the Hittite Empire, a powerhouse that dominated parts of Anatolia and Syria in the late Bronze Age. The mythical Hittites suddenly had kings with names, treaties with Egypt, bureaucrats complaining about grain shipments. What had looked like a ghost people from religious texts were now solidly part of the historical map. In this case, the myth didn't invent a civilization. It preserved the memory of one we'd almost managed to lose. Ancient Greek writers occasionally mention a wealthy Egyptian port city near the mouth of the Nile, Heraklion. Egyptian inscriptions called it Thonis. It's the kind of place that shows up in stories about trade, temples and heroic visits. But, awkwardly, it was nowhere to be found on modern maps. Some historians suspected exaggeration. Others thought the city's role had been folded into better-known ports like Alexandria. Then underwater archaeologist Frank Goddio started surveying Abukir Bay off Egypt's coast in the late 1990s. On the seafloor, his team found massive temple ruins, colossal statues of pharaohs and gods, toppled but intact, stone blocks with inscriptions naming Thonis Heraklion. Sediment cores and geological studies suggested that parts of the Nile Delta here had gradually subsided and then collapsed, taking the city down with it. Heraklion hadn't been made up. It had simply moved from the shoreline into the historical blind spot beneath the waves. In this case, archaeology didn't just confirm a name from old texts, it restored an entire vanished port that once controlled the gateway between Egypt and the Mediterranean. In Arabian tradition and in the Quran, there's a reference to Aram of the Pillars, a wealthy city associated with a people who defied God and were destroyed. Western explorers later spun that into the legend of Ubar, a lost city in the empty Quartet Desert. sometimes called the Atlantis of the Sands. For a long time, this was treated much like other lost city legends, romantic, atmospheric, and probably not real. In the early 1990s, a team led by archaeologist Eurus Zanis used a then new tool, satellite imagery. They traced ancient caravan routes across Oman's desert, literally faint scars in the sands where traders had once walked. Those routes converged on a site called Shisar. On the ground, excavations revealed a ruined fortress-like structure, deeply collapsed underground chambers, evidence that the site had once controlled the frankincense trade. The current thinking is cautious. Shisar wasn't a glittering desert metropolis the way later storytellers imagined. It was more like a key trading outpost and water source that became a symbol for a whole region's wealth. But again, we see the pattern. A story about a doomed city in the sands, a convergence of caravan routes, and a real place that plausibly sits behind the legend, now dug out of the dunes. Finally, let's head into the Amazon. European explorers in the 1500s and 1600s came back with wild stories. Riverbanks lined with large settlements, fields, and earthworks, and somewhere a golden man, or city we now shorthand as El Dorado. Later expeditions mostly saw disease-ravaged, depopulated forests, but the 20th century, the orthodox view was simple. Dense, complex cities can't survive in this soil. Those early reports were fantasy or exaggeration. Then, archaeologists added another high-tech tool, LiDAR, laser scanning from aircraft that can strip away the forest canopy and reveal shapes on the ground. In recent years, LiDAR surveys in parts of the Amazon, especially in Bolivia and Brazil, have revealed gridded street plants, platform mounds, defensive earthworks and causeways, landscapes engineered with canals and raised fields. Not a single golden megacity, but networks of interconnected towns supporting tens of thousands of people. So were the early Europeans describing exactly what LiDAR now shows? Probably not. Were they simply hallucinating civilization where there was only untouched jungle? Also no. Once again, the myth looks less like pure invention and more like a distorted memory of real, complex societies that were nearly erased, first by disease and conquest, then by our own assumptions about what the rainforest could support. Across all 7 of these stories, there's a pattern. Myths stretch the truth. They add gods, glowing heroes, golden cities, dramatic moral lessons, but underneath, they often cling to something stubbornly real. A city on the hill, a port on the delta, warrior women on horseback, an empire carved into stone, or a cluster of villages hidden under the canopy. For a long time, it was convenient to dismiss these stories as naive. Then the spades, scanners, and sediment cores started disagreeing. That doesn't mean every legend hides a lost civilization waiting to be found. For every Troy, there are plenty of pure inventions. But it does mean that when ancient people insisted, no, we really did see this place, or these people really did exist, we should think twice before assuming we know better. Because sometimes the line between myth and history isn't a wall, it's a fog. And every new discovery clears just a little more of it away. If you'd like a deep dive into how historians decide what counts as real and what gets filed under legend, stick around. I've got another video queued up that pulls apart exactly that process. Thanks for watching Fiction Foundry. I'll see you in the next one.